Hello, hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
Today, our guest is Dr. Emily A. Willoughby, and we're going to be having an exciting conversation. The usual topic is IQ. I know most of us love to talk about IQ. We like to talk about the heritability of IQ, adoption studies, and the environment. So, Emily, you're quite famous. Recently, you penned a paper with your co-authors that confirmed that IQ has high heritability. Please tell us about the paper, Emily. But before you do so, I want you to talk about adoption studies. Why are they important? What do we learn when we engage in an adoption study? What's an adoption study?
Yeah, sure. So adoption studies are kind of used alongside twin and family studies in behavior genetics to try and partial out environmental and genetic effects on various traits. And so twin studies generally look at how similar identical and fraternal twins respectively are for a given phenotype. And so when identical twins are much more similar than dizygotic twins, we know that the trait is heritable. Adoption studies are kind of the inverse of that, where we look at families with unrelated children, or children unrelated to their parents. And so the biggest utility of adoption designs is that they can more precisely disentangle genetic and environmental sources of variance. So since adoptive individuals share all of their rearing environments, but none of their genetic variants with their adoptive parents, researchers generally consider adoption studies to be a more robust and powerful method of testing for the presence of environmental influence. But since adoption and twin studies have different assumptions, which can become violated in various ways and therefore distort these heritability estimates, we kind of need both types of study together. And so when the assumptions are different, we can kind of conduct both types of study to achieve sort of a consensus about heritability for a given trait.
And the name of the study is Genetic and Environmental Contributions to IQ in Adoptive and Biological Families with 30-year-old Offspring. And Emily, the cohort, it's a Swedish cohort, right?
No, this is a Minnesota
Oh, not a
cohort.
Minnesota cohort, sorry.
Yes.
I was reading another study. Okay, in this study, did you cite a Swedish study?
Yes, we did.
Yes,
We cited,
exactly.
I think, yeah, Kendler and his colleagues use a Swedish co-sibling control design that we cite.
Yes, exactly. So, Emily, how is IQ affected by the environment? Because this is really the point of your study to disentangle the link between IQ and environment, if any.
Right. So there have been quite a few studies over the years indicating that the environment does impact IQ. And I think these studies are legitimate. Most of them generally show that this usually, when the environment affects IQ, it usually happens in a negative direction. So lots of studies out there show things like malnutrition, extremely low socioeconomic status environments, and poor education, stuff like that. All of those things can lower IQ in childhood. It's much harder to persistently raise IQ. Education seems to be one of the only factors that has at least a small, long-lasting effect. But the big question is really persistence, right? So if if you're raised in like a really high IQ environment, lots of access to books and learning devices and education and teachers, low rates of problems or crime, all of that stuff, that does seem to have a positive effect on kids' IQs. And there have been a lot of studies showing that. The Swedish study you mentioned, that involved like 18 to 20-year-old adopted Swedish conscripts. They were raised by higher SES families, and they showed a mean gain of IQ of about 4 points, 3 to 4 points. And that was replicated also. There's a classic study in 1989, I think, showed it was a cross-fostering study of 14-year-old French children, and that showed also a small gain in IQ. But the problem is that once the kids grow up or the kids are removed from this intervention, this high IQ environment, whatever it may be, that these effects tend to fade out. And so Sandra Scar, also of the University of Minnesota, was one of the first to observe this phenomenon, that adopted kids did seem to have gains in IQ, but when they got to adolescence, these gains started to kind of drop off over time. So the main goal of this current study that we did is to ask the question of, do any IQ gains gained from adoption actually persist well into adulthood? And there have been very few studies looking at that question. It's mostly children and adolescents. Or like in the Swedish study, very recently ex-adolescent young adults, 18 to 20 years old. So we wanted to look at a sample of kids who have completely grown up, have their own families, their own jobs, moved out away from their parents. And we wanted to see if those IQ effects had any persistence over that long span of time.
All right. And what's your conclusion, Emily?
Well, we found that in the sample of 32-year-old is the mean age of these kids now. We found that the adopted families had almost negligible correlation with their parents' IQ in the adoptive cohorts. So this seems to indicate that the fade out phenomenon that Scar observed back in 1989 really does continue into adulthood until it pretty much drops off altogether.
And Emily, what are the implications of this study? Because some have argued that due to the high heritability of IQ and the link between IQ and academic performance and job performance, welfare is justified, or we should do more to invest in low IQ people. So what are the implications of this study?
Well, yeah, that's a tricky question, because the study itself, we don't really make any like policy recommendations or anything, because that's a very sticky situation. But I mean, one implication is it's probably not a really worthwhile goal to deliberately try to change your children's personalities. And that includes IQ, and it also includes other things too. But if we invest a huge number of resources and money and time into with the specific goal of trying to boost IQs, people might be kind of disappointed at how much that's possible. Now, that's not to say it's not possible at all. And of course, it's worthwhile to make sure that kids have access to education and to low crime environments, and try to boost outcomes in other ways. But I think the really more important thing here is just that we should work towards a world that values people regardless of their IQ. And we want to, rather than boosting IQ as a specific goal, we want to help people achieve their potential, whatever that may be. But actually trying to change IQ in a positive direction, in a way that's persistent and long lasting, is an uphill battle for sure.
I agree with you, Emily. IQ is important, but due to the dynamism of the market economy, one does not need to be particularly brilliant to be successful. And I use these examples all the time. So there's a lady, I don't know her intelligence, but she photoshops dogs on social media and people like that product. So the appetite of
Mhm.
consumer is quite weird. So anybody can make millions or billions depending on their ability to market that product. And their academics who are highly educated were not as successful as people on YouTube. So I often tell people that the market is so flexible that one does not need to be super brilliant to become a successful or to acquire self-worth. He needs to actualize his talent and his potential. So on my other YouTube channel, I created a short video about 1 minute and 53 seconds titled Embracing Your Inner Weirdness. Yes, and that's a catch. Newton was a weirdo. We know Newton and his
Oh
theories
yeah.
quite well, but we don't know his critics. Many of his critics have become obscure characters. So IQ is important, but I wouldn't worry too much about IQ, especially with the emergence of the influencer economy.
Yes, I agree completely. I also, from another angle, I think that unfortunately society kind of undervalues working class type jobs. I mean, I am an academic, and I would say that most academics do have no idea whatsoever how to fix a toilet, how to change their oil, how to do an incredible number of very basic things. And we rely on people to do those things. And those things are important. They're just as important as academic pursuits. So I think that encouraging people to use their talents to the best of their ability and working towards a society that values people who contribute these skills that we need, whether they're high IQ skills or not, is really important.
And Emily, most people would not envision living in a society where Bill Gates is the norm. Because if Bill Gates is the norm, that means that society is hyper competitive. And if Bill Gates is the norm, that means that Bill Gates is not that smart.
Yeah,
So
right. It's all relative.
exactly. So people who are lobbying to use science to increase IQ could be on the wrong side of history because in a world where IQ scores are higher, really, really high, that's a big problem. We're going to live in a society that's hyper competitive. So if the average IQ is 100, but due to advancements in science and technology, the average IQ becomes 120 or 130, how do people with below average IQ survive? And if the average IQ is 120 or 130, you're an average person. So an exceptional IQ would be like 200 or 190. So the
Yeah.
dynamics, yes, the dynamics of the situation cannot be the same again.
Yeah. This is a big question of debate about this kind of burgeoning field of embryo selection that is constantly debated among behavior geneticists nowadays, that embryo selection for traits that we ostensibly value in society is becoming a very real possibility now with genomic technology. And so people are cautioning, well, if we encourage embryo selection for IQ, for example, then in a couple generations, we have no idea what society is going to look like. And there's a very real possibility that it could look much worse than it is today. It could really, it could exacerbate income inequality and other kinds of social inequality. It could, selection for IQ could bring along various health conditions that are unfortunate genetic correlations with intelligence. It could lead to all kinds of really huge, wide-scale problems that we need to think about and caution against.
Emily, what are some of these ailments that are correlated with intelligence?
Well, one very classic example is Tay-Sachs. It's a pretty debilitating disorder that I believe is at least somewhat related to intelligence. Other things that are genetically correlated with intelligence that I wouldn't exactly call ailments, but sometimes have certain limitations and difficulties associated with them. A good example is autism.
Yes, I was
So
just about to
autism
say that.
spectrum disorders are, yeah, yeah, are somewhat correlated with intelligence. And obviously there are a huge number of very productive, very intelligent people on the autism spectrum. but we simply don't know what a society looks like where the entire ruling class is susceptible to autistic traits.
We do
We
know.
just don't know. I mean, it's
We do know,
yeah.
Emily, it's a
Do we?
society with low rates of fertility. Yes, intelligent people are less likely to reproduce.
Yes, right. That's definitely the case.
And
Yep.
people would be socially awkward in that society. So in a sense, we can figure out a potential society where the ruling class is predominantly autistic.
Yes. Yeah, I guess that's the case. Another example, a little bit further, that people consider a valuable capacity. It has a lot to do with intelligence. It has a lot to do with scientific discovery, creation of great works of art. It's also somewhat correlated with intelligence, and creativity is also correlated with schizophrenia. And
Yes.
so if we select for intelligence and creativity, then we might end up with a society that's, full of people with more propensity for schizophrenia and autism and other things as well.
And another downside of high intelligence is that intelligent people, because of their creativity, they're likely to innovate. Innovation is a hard. It can take years before an innovation can materialize. Therefore, people need to work and be productive. So if we're in a space where most people are innovating or tinkering with new ideas because they're highly intelligent, how do we get to produce?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um,
Yeah, how do we get to produce
yeah,
when we're
yeah,
always researching?
right, yeah. Yeah, we always need people to actually do the hands-on work and do the work that no one else wants to do and make things and build things. And we need all strata of society to be
Yes,
a
yes, Emily. And Emily, I don't know if you're familiar with this research, but the upshot of modern society is that new studies are showing that as we age, we can become more intelligent. So our mathematical skills do improve, our verbal ability also improves. Therefore, if one has low IQ, even though IQ is heritable because of future improvements, what we can compensate for low IQ. So we're not incorrigible people. We can learn, we can become receptive to new information. Recently, I read a story about a janitor who died in his 90s and his estate was around 8 million. Why 8 million? Because of investing. How do you invest? Well, it's a risk. You have to take the risk and you learn from others. So human
Mhm.
beings are not incorrigible. So I think that's another important
Right.
point. So even if IQ is low, we have the potential to improve ourselves as people. All right.
Yes. Right. And going back to the idea of parenting effects and intervention effects and so on, even though IQ does not seem very susceptible in the positive direction to improvements, there are other capacities that are just as important or arguably more important than IQ, which are somewhat. And conscientiousness and hardworkingness, those seem to be like one great example is the Perry preschool project, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
That this preschool intervention did not seem to improve the IQs of the kids after the intervention was over. But what it did improve is the outcomes for the kids. They still even well into adolescence or adulthood, they still had lower rates of crime. They had lower rates of other kinds of legal problems. They saved more money, stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, interventions are still important to improve just various other aspects of the human condition for sure.
Because of the perception. When people have a positive perception of themselves, they're likely to succeed. So the peer intervention was about
Hmm.
changing the perception of these students. For a long time, I
Yeah,
was trying to
right.
remember the name of that study where the students weren't that bright, but they did better because they were told that they were bright.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the Perry study,
I don't
but
know if there's,
yeah, but I'm quite familiar
I
with it.
don't think that's replicated.
Okay,
Yeah.
oh, that wasn't replicated. Okay, but I'm quite familiar with some of these studies showing that people change their worldview in response to a stimulating in environment. Now, Emily,
Yes.
in your article,
Hmm.
you mentioned how these scores were calculated. It's a bit technical, but I want you to really explain the method employed to arrive at the conclusion. So, how is this type of research really conducted? What tools are used?
Yeah, sure. So first I'll talk a little bit about the sample.
Yeah, how
So
large was the sample? How large
this
is the
sample,
sample?
right. So our sample consisted of about 220 adoptive families, 164 biological families, and 96 mixed families with adopted and biological kids. So in aggregate, that's about 600 parents, about 360 adoptive offspring, and 300 biological offspring in the sample. So this sample has been assessed multiple times with the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research, the MCTFR. They were first measured on IQ between about 1998 and 2004. And this is when the average age of the kids was about 15, standard deviation of about 1.5 years. And so we followed this cohort of families across multiple assessments over time up until the present. And the adoptive families were identified from adoption agencies in Minnesota through birth records and so on. They're for the study, they're required to have at least one parent and two offspring who were adolescents at the time. And all of the adoptive kids in the sample were required to have been placed for adoption before reaching 2 years of age. So the mean age of adoption placement was about 4.5 months. So they were all very little. These aren't like foster kids. These are all pretty much adopted as infants or toddlers. And so the way we did this in at the most recent assessment, which began in about 2017, we conducted a phone interview and a mailed or online survey to get their data. So currently these adoptive and biological children are now about 32 years old. So basically we set up a survey, either mailed or online or on the phone, that consisted of a huge number of questionnaires. We also had a bunch of like personality questionnaires and home environment questionnaires and all this stuff, but we also assessed them on IQ. And at intake, when they were 15, they took the Wechsler, the Wechsler for children on IQ, and in the current sample, they took the International Cognitive Ability Resource sample test, the ICAR, which is a fairly strong measure of IQ as well. And then once we have all of the data on the parents and the offspring, adoptive and biological, we do what we call biometric modeling, where we have a path model that is able to kind of fit the parent offspring correlations based on the original equations that relate to how these individuals relate to each other, and sources of variance are then fit to these correlations. And that basically produces these measures of heritability or additive genetic influence, as well as parental environment and sibling environment. So we looked at not just the environment fostered by the parents, but we also looked at sibling correlations and whether siblings were influencing one another over time. And then this also enables us to look at the amount of gene environment covariance. So we're very interested in passive gene environment correlation in these cases. We want to see, for a given genetic propensity for a trait, how much the environment actually is related to that indirectly. So for those maybe not familiar, passive gene environment correlation refers to this phenomenon by which parents pass not only their genes to their offspring in a regular biological family, but they also transmit the environment that the parents selected for based on their own genetics. So like parents who maybe are very musically talented, music ability also has high heritability. So these parents might have, you know, lots of sheet music in the house. They have instruments in the house. They might, you know, kind of pressure their kids into taking piano lessons when they're little, that kind of thing. And so if the kids also inherited a genetic propensity for music, then they have direct access to the environment that fosters it also. So our model was able to partial out this GE covariance aspect. And then the remainder of variance is the non-shared environment, which refers to every unique or individual experience that one has that's not influenced by family or by genetics, but really just by things that happen. And that can include like individual peer relationships, individual experiences. It can also include things like, you know, noise during development. You know, when an embryo is developing, if an electron zigs this way instead of that way, then that can cause different outcomes also. And then measurement error is also implicit in shared environment, non-shared environment. That's why we call it E for error.
Emily, what are placement effects?
Right. So placement effects are kind of one of the largest historical complaints and criticisms about adoption studies. So I mentioned that twin and adoption studies have different assumptions. One of the assumptions implicit in adoption studies is that adoption is basically a random process, that when you go to an adoption agency and you apply to adopt a child, that the child that you are assigned to is kind of just a random shuffle, which would make an adoption study approximate a natural experiment. But in reality, this might not always be the case. It might be the case that the adopted child has some kind of perceived similarity to the parents. And historically, this has been the case. I think early adoption agencies actually used to try to place adopted kids with parents who resembled them in like hair color and eye color and stuff like that. I think that was kind of trying to achieve the appearance of, you know, them being a biological unit so as to avoid discrimination or whatever. But it also, that kind of thing also introduces problems for adoption studies, because if the kids are more closely resembling their parents than would be expected by chance, then that's going to bias our biometric estimates. So in our current study, we actually conducted an empirical test of adoption placement for education. This is the percent of our sample in the Minnesota adoptive cohort is actually genotyped. So that means that we can make polygenic scores for the parents and the offspring and then see if they're correlated. And since these polygenic scores are for years of education, which is highly correlated with IQ, if we observe a significant positive correlation between the adoptive kid's polygenic score and their parents' polygenic score, that would be strong evidence for adoption placement, that somehow more intelligent or educated parents were placed with more intelligent or propensity for education, at least in the kids. So we were able to look at those correlations to do an empirical test of this criticism against adoption studies.
Emily, in the future, do you plan to research the effects of early childhood education programs?
I don't have anything like that planned. I don't usually work with kids in my samples that I currently have access to.
Okay,
Would certainly
because
be interesting, but yeah.
because there's an ongoing debate. Do these programs really work? And as we discussed earlier, the gains of the environment peter out in adulthood. So are these programs feasible? That's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, I don't know about early education having an effect. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. But one of the few studies that has actually convinced me that education can have a downstream effect was this big meta-analysis that was done a few years ago about the length of education and its effects on IQ well after the educational period is over. And they found that there was a very small but consistent effect of length of education that persisted into adulthood with its effects on IQ. I mean, the effect was only like 2 to 3 points, but I mean, that's still kind of compelling that, you know, if the entire population were boosted 2 to 3 IQ points, that would still be a significant change. I mean, there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that education is part of the Flynn effect, at least, which, you know, the Flynn effect has IQ over time,
Yes, the secular
where
increase in the
there
IQ
seems to
over
be
time. There was a breakup, but you
yeah,
can continue to speak.
yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm saying that there was a breakup when you were explaining the Flynn effect, but you can continue to speak.
Oh, right. Okay, so sorry. So the Flynn effect is what we call a secular gain in IQ. It relates to this observation that there seems to be some kind of society-wide force that's entirely environmental in origin that has caused IQ scores to go up slowly and steadily over multiple generations now. And nobody is totally sure what was caused the Flynn effect. We know that it can't be genetics. It's happened too fast to be genetics. We know that it's not things like parenting because we see this effect throughout all kinds of families, all over the Western world, in fact. And many things have been proposed to try and explain the Flynn effect. Things like better access to nutrition, better access to education, fewer like viruses in early childhood that can affect brain development and so on. So education probably is part of that. That you know, education is standardized compared to several generations ago. More people are getting educated. You know, early education is compulsory. And so all of these things probably contribute, which makes it seem like education may indeed have at least a small effect on IQ, but we're seeing this peter out. This effect is
Yes,
petering out
it's
over
been
time
reversed.
as well.
Yes, that's a term some people use.
Yeah.
The Flynn effect is being reversed. So, Emily, speaking to you
Yeah.
has been a pleasure. Your voice is indeed melodious, but these days I am doing shorter shows. When I started around 2 years ago, people would speak for over 1 hour, sometimes nearly two, but there's a demand for shorter shows, and that's why we have to end now. But you have been great.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been
All right.
fun.
And thanks for coming on, Emily. I really appreciate it. I just love your voice. You're great. And Emily, before you go, we have few women who talk about IQ. So you are well, you're,
Yeah.
I really appreciate your research. I like, what's her name? Linda? Yes, Linda. Linda is really interesting. But there are
Linda
few, yeah,
Godfredson.
yes, but there are few women who are unafraid to come on to come on a show like this and talk about IQ. So again, thanks. Bye.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.
Bye.